Thank you, Julie, and thank you for arranging these classes. Thanks, My Jewish Learning. So lovely to be with you all. I see some familiar faces and names and some new friends. So yeah, as Julie said, I'm originally from London, so this is how I speak. So I hope that's going to be okay. I see some people from planet Earth in the chat. That was a good one, and some people from all different continents represented. It's exciting to have such a global community. So I'm going to share my screen so we can see the handout already easily all together here. So I hope that's convenient. And then please feel free to jump in with questions and comments on the chat. And if I don't see them right away, Julie can actually hopefully alert me to them if I'm not seeing them right away, but I'll come back and check in. We'll talk about what's going on. I want to hear people's questions and comments very much. So put stuff on the chat as it comes up for you. So I'll just share my screen. Here's the handout. So this line in the title, let's start with, we'll talk about who Rebbe Nachman was, a bit of biography and background. This line in the title, the fire that still burns, is a saying that Rabbi Nachman said. He said to his followers, and we'll tell the whole story about what that means. He said to his followers, my fire will burn until the Messiah comes. That's a quote attributed to him. And funnily enough, at the time he said it, that seemed like a very unlikely claim, because believe it or not, because you're all here in this class, presumably because you heard of Rebbe Nachman. So these days he has something of a name and a reputation and a following. But at the time of his own life, and even actually the time following his life, basically since he was alive, which you can see is the end of the 1700s and beginning of the 1800s, since he was alive until relatively recently, just a few decades ago, his Torah, his teachings, and his following is actually a very, very small movement without a great deal of influence beyond itself. And it's actually a very recent phenomena that there's been an explosion of interest in it, and it's become a real mainstay of Israeli culture, of Jewish culture, something that a lot of people refer to all the time in different ways, something that even now is common in popular music in Israel and throughout the Jewish world in popular culture. So it's his comment that his fire will burn until the Messiah comes turned out to be weirdly prophetic. That there would be this, of course we don't know when the Messiah is coming, no making that claim, but just that there would be this renewal of interest in him and his teachings in the future. So let's start at the beginning. A few points here about biography, who he was. Born in 1772, the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov was the founder of the Hasidic movement. The Baal Shem Tov, to give some timeline, was born around 1700. So Rebbe Nachman here, the great-grandson, born 1772. And actually that exact year, 1772, the year that Rebbe Nachman was born, was a very, very important year in the Hasidic movement that his great-grandfather had founded. It was the year that not the Baal Shem Tov himself, but the follower, the successor of the Baal Shem Tov, passed away. And that meant that the movement basically officially became a mass movement in the way that we might be familiar with it, made up of many, many different dynasties. Until that point, you had the Baal Shem Tov and his successor, who was the Maggid of Mezrich. And then after that, the Hasidic movement spread out to be, for example, some of you may be familiar with the Chabad or Lubavitch dynasty and all of the teachings that come from that. And then some of you may have heard of the Chernobyl or Twersky dynasty and all the teachings and followers that come from that, and so on. So there were dozens, many dozens, maybe hundreds of those dynasties at one point or another. And he was born at that exact moment that Hasidism started to be so multiplicitous in that way. Now, a very key point in his life journey, and we'll refer back to this as it comes up during the teachings, that we need to know is that he tried to go to the land of Israel, and he did eventually make it there. It was a very perilous and eventful journey, and that he sees that as a big turning point in his life. In fact, he actually said when he got back from the land of Israel, burn everything I wrote before. Everything I said before was worthless. This is a whole new part of my life. That's just something just a piece we need to know up front in this, shortened biography, and then we'll fill in the gaps as we go. A couple of other points here. In 1802, he moved to Breslov, and that's, of course, what he's named for. Rebbe Nachman of Breslov is how we know him now. So he moved there relatively late in his very short life. He remained there until 1810. The last year of his life was spent in the town of Uman in Ukraine, where he died of tuberculosis at the early age of 39. So he was in Breslov for that crucial time and then moved to Uman. And Uman, the place where he's buried, is the place where still now, in fact, now more than ever, tens of thousands of Jews go to make pilgrimage to his grave, especially around Rosh Hashanah. It's a huge gathering. One last thing here in this little section of biography, gave over his last lesson to hundreds of followers on Rosh Hashanah 1810 and passed away a few weeks later on the 18th day of Tishrei, and that relates to October 1810. And he was buried in Uman, and many thousands of pilgrims, as I said, visit his grave every year, especially in Rosh Hashanah. So he's very strongly connected to Rosh Hashanah. That's part of the reason the pilgrims go on Rosh Hashanah, and to all of the festivals of Tishrei, like Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, and so on. All right, now instead of, I could tell you more about him, my general impressions and what I've read and so on, I'm actually going to let two masters of the field and real experts in Rebbe Nachman do a bit of the talking for the next couple of little sections. We've got some great quotes here from Elie Wiesel and Arthur Green, two real authorities on Rebbe Nachman and Hasidism. So first from Elie Wiesel, and by the way, this book that these quotes are from, Souls on Fire, is a very beautiful and wonderful book. I really highly recommend it. If anyone interested in Hasidism, it's very accessible, it's very rich, it has stories, it has teachings, it's a really nice mix of like a bit of history with a lot of folk wisdom, and really beautifully done. So Elie Wiesel says about Rebbe Nachman, his life, rich in exploits, seems to lie under the sign of paradox and fever, on mountain peaks and precipices, in outright hallucination and never security. That's a very important point, and we'll see that point reiterated in different ways, and we'll see how it comes up in his teachings. So fever, paradox, high ups and downs, but not security. There's no like just like stable, keep everything the same, do the same thing. That's like the opposite. He goes on, he alternated between highly communicative ecstasy and the blackest depressions, similar kind of thing. Laughter occupies an astonishingly important place in his work. Laughter of protest against the absurdities of existence, a laughter of revolt against the universe where man, whatever he may do, is condemned in advance. A laughter of compassion for man who cannot escape the ambiguity of his condition and of his faith. To blindly submit to God without questioning the meaning of this submission would be to diminish him, God. So this is a really interesting point. Part of the reason a lot of people find Rebbe Nachman so modern or even postmodern, so compelling today. As I mentioned, there's been this real renewal of interest in him, even in modern Israel and across the Jewish world, which is, in many ways, he's super traditional and pious, and he's very, very into prayer and traditional practice. But also, there's this kind of rebellious streak, and there's this quality of standing up to God and questioning God and saying, like, what's going on here? Like, I am praying to you, God, and I believe in you, and I submit to you. But like, what does that mean? Really like pushing the limits of consciousness and how deep we can go into a relationship with the divine mystery. Lastly, Rebbe Nachman knew how to laugh, wanted to laugh mostly about himself. So again, that point about absurdity that you mentioned before. I'm going to read the quotes from Arthur Green, and then I'll stop sharing my screen so I can come back to you all and see what's on the chat and see if anyone wants to make any comments or ask any questions before we go on. So first of all, from Arthur Green, his biography of Rebbe Nachman, Tormented Master. For Rebbe Nachman, the true core of religion is that struggle for faith which goes on in the heart of the believer. So also a really important point. That's what he's really concerned with. That's what he's speaking to most often, is how hard it is to have this ongoing relationship with the divine mystery that we can't see, smell, touch, but sometimes we might feel in some ways, and then we're left alone without it, and that struggle for faith that goes on. The psychological complexities of the individual and the theological mysteries of the universe are intertwined. What does that mean? It means what's going on in here and what's going on out there are actually one and the same. And Rebbe Nachman didn't make up that principle. That really is a claim that all mysticism makes, and Kabbalah as Jewish mysticism is a tradition that Rebbe Nachman is based on. He's part of the Hasidic movement. Hasidism is based in very large part on Kabbalah. So he's really just taking it to a new level of psychological intensity. Like he describes what's going on in here to a level of intensity that no one else had done before. And interestingly, he's doing that at the same time that the great romantic poets are doing that in Germany and in England. And I don't really know much about the German ones because I don't know that language. But I know that I studied the English romantic poets, and part of what was new and great about them was like Wordsworth and Keats and Byron. Those people, if you've heard of them, some of you may know their stuff. So what was great about them, the reason they caused such a big stir was they were describing what's going on inside us psychologically to a new level of complexity. So he was actually part of the same wave of consciousness in a way, of course, in a different part of the world, not connected to that directly or linguistically even, but the same consciousness in some ways was rising in him in a different way. Nachman's journey to the land of Israel in 1798 to 99 has long been seen as a major turning point in his life, as I mentioned before. Nothing was more real to him than the inner flux with which he lived so constantly. That's really important. We'll see the teachings shortly from him, and we're starting with some really big, important ones. And you'll see this inner turmoil that he lived with was like the constant setting, the constant scene of therefore what he said to his followers, of what he taught. Last point, and this is an important thing which we won't have time to go into today, but in the second and third class we will have time to look at. In Breslov alone, meaning in this school of Hasidism alone, only under Rabbi Nachman's Hasidism, is the tzaddik portrayed most prominently as Redeemer, and particularly as a Redeemer from the burden of sin. So this is unusual, right? In fact, Ralph Green says here, unique. There's no other Rebbe, and there were lots of other Hasidic Rebbes and who were tzaddikim, who were righteous people, and who many of whom even claimed to do miracles for their followers, but none of them said, I will redeem you from sin, in a way that actually sounds reminiscent of certain other religion. And Rebbe Nachman was very controversial for that reason. That was one of the things that even after he died, there was a lot of pushback and controversy against him and his movement, even from other Hasidim, even from those who seemingly had a lot in common. They were very wary and even sometimes persecuted his followers very severely because they felt that some things Rebbe Nachman said were just heretical. So it's important to know that that controversy was there from the beginning, certainly with the opponents of the Hasidic movement, the misnagdim, the opponents, but even with other Hasidim too. We'll come back together now, and then we'll be ready to begin the text, which is coming soon. So I would love to hear people's comments and questions on the chat. I see a few things. I see a lot of things. Right, I'm going to scroll up and start. I'm going to start where I can start. I'm sorry that some folks are having trouble understanding my accent. That is, I'm doing my best to speak. Right, Frank says, is the story of Rabbi Nachman meeting the Sufi mystic in Israel true or just an interesting legend? I honestly don't know, Frank. I had the same question about that. I'm sorry I can't give you a definitive answer. There are a lot of stories about him that have a quality of mystery about them like that we don't know that for sure. Let me keep saying. Marty says, are the Wiesel quotes direct? Yes, completely direct, and the quotes from the other book too, from Marty Green, completely one-for-one quotes. I hope you'll give us some psychological thoughts and ideas about Rebbe Nachman, said someone on the chat. Yeah, we will talk a little bit about the psychology going on, but at the same time, I'm not going to try and diagnose someone living so long ago who we don't have direct experience of. Arthur Green does do that in his book, if you're interested in going down that road. Laura says, please repeat the person who died the year he was born. Was he considered a reincarnation? Good question, Laura. No, wasn't. It was the Maggid of Mezrich the Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezrich, who was the successor to the Baal Shem Tov. And no, he was not considered a reincarnation. I've never heard that, as far as I know. I was more just pointing out he happened to be born at this big turning point where the Hasidic movement really became this mass movement in a lot of ways. Frank says another great book is Palace of Pearls. Yes, I have heard of that book and I've heard it's wonderful, but I haven't seen it. But Howard Schwartz is amazing, so I'm sure anything by him is great. Perhaps Beckett can be understood in light of the Rebbe. So Nancy, you are onto a very strong thread there, and I've actually seen that talked about by rabbis who are very deeply steeped experts in Rebbe Nachman, that he is connected to like postmodern absurdism and the work of Samuel Beckett. So yeah, you're into something there. Jay says one could make the case that he was bipolar. That is exactly the case that Arthur Green does make in his book, and a lot of people push back against it. I'm not really, as I say, an expert to offer an expert opinion one way or the other, but that's a whole conversation that's going on out there for people who are interested. Yes, exactly. Samuel says, would he be considered manic depressive? So yeah, bipolar, manic depressive, exactly. Different. I think, as far as I'm aware, those are different labels for something very similar. Yes, exactly. Joe asked about depression. I addressed that. Erica says he was obviously very charismatic. To have such followers for one so young, is it possible there's a connection there to his wanting to be a redeemer? Yes. And Erica, actually, that's a whole theme, the whole redemption theme, and his relationship with his followers. That will really be something we go into more in the next section, and not so much in today's class. But that's like, we have a lot of sources and teachings to look at about that. So we'll speak more about that then. And I think, yes, exactly. Elizabeth confirmed that manic depressive equals bipolar. I thought so. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And I see a hand. Someone raised a hand, which is Miss B. Mia. Would you like to say something, please?
Hi, Rabbi. I was wondering, was it this Rebbe that told the story about the magical goat that had the snuff box horns?
Oh, that I believe that's the Kotzker Rebbe, which is that's one of my favorite stories, or I love so much. But different Rebbe who lived at almost exactly the same time, and actually also had some very strong psychological issues. Although again, we don't know exactly what they were. So they actually have a lot in common, these two people, but different person.
Got it. Because it does seem like around mysticism and Kabbalah, there's sort of this fear of kind of like insanity, and how if you're not properly steeped in the tradition, to take that on for yourself can really cause one to go mad. And I just wondered if you had comments to that.
I had trouble just, I'm sorry, could you repeat just the last bit of the question, because I had trouble hearing it?
I was asking about how there is this belief that a study of Kabbalah, without like being steeped properly in the traditions, in the Talmud and Torah and Tanakh and such, that it can cause one to go mad. And I was wondering if that might be playing into some of these feelings that that the Rebbe's, some of these Rebbe's were struggling with mental health issues.
Thank you for the question. So I should actually clarify something. I should say, really, first of all, in response to it, I should explain that he actually did grow up completely within the tradition, and he would have been steeped in Kabbalah. So sorry if I didn't make that more clear. I didn't give it like a full biography, but he grew up completely within a traditional Hasidic setting. In fact, the house that he grew up in just happened to be the same house that the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, had lived in. And he grew up, very much in the family. I'll also mention, since we're talking about, like that aspect at time of his life, I'll say he was known for going off into nature and spending a lot of time off in nature, praying, talking to God, and so on. But yeah, he was certainly also received the education, the Jewish textual and Kabbalistic education of that community. I see a few more things on the chat. Leah says, at what age did he go to Israel? And I would have to look at the sheet and see. I think he went in 1798, right? And he was born in 1772, so it looks like 26. somebody asked me in a message, why did he leave Israel and return to Breslov? And it's an interesting story. He was in Israel a very short time. He had a few interesting encounters there, with all of which are these stories which we don't know if they really happened or not, like the encounter with the Sufi mystic. And then after a very short time, really, it could have been as short as just a few days, maybe a few weeks maximum, he turned to his followers and said, I have achieved what I came to do spiritually just by being here, and now I'm ready to go home and be a new person. And as I said before, when he went home from that trip, he said, burn everything I said before. I'm now a new person. Everything I'm going to say from now on is going to be the real stuff. So that's what happened from his side in Israel. One more thing on the chat. One commentary I read said that Rabbi Nachman was very intelligent and he absorbed people's problems, which led to depression. So yeah, that's certainly one way of understanding it. And Rochelle, we'll talk about that more also when we talk about the whole relationship with his followers and what that meant to him, which will come up more in the second session and the third session. Brilliant. Thank you everyone so much. That was a lot of really great comments, insights, questions, really helpful. Let's see some of his teachings. We're actually going to start with a few shorter ones, but very important ones. And then we're going to dive into a long one, which is considered very classic and important. And then we'll see if we have time to go beyond that. We'll go as far as we can go. So number one, I should say a word about what the text is we're learning from. Likutei Moharan literally means gleanings or selected teachings from the master, from our rabbi. And he wrote volume 1 of it. It's actually the only thing that he wrote himself. A lot of great spiritual masters in our tradition didn't write anything, so we're lucky he wrote something. Very often the teachings were only written down by the students. So he wrote volume 1 of it, and then his successor, who was called Rebbe Nosson, or Rebbe Natan, is generally known, according to Ashkenazi pronunciation, Rebbe Nosson. Rebbe Nosson, his follower and successor and teacher, wrote volume 2 based on what Rebbe Nachman has said. And I should mention also Rebbe Nosson is also the one who wrote everything else we have about what Rebbe Nachman said, and his biography and stories about him, just everything else that we have in the Breslov canon that goes back to Rebbe Nachman is really through Rebbe Nosson. So we're very dependent on him. And I actually should also say a word about the relationship between them. It's important. It's an important part of the story. And I used the word just now, successor. That's a little bit misleading because actually, and this relates to Arthur Green's last point. Just scroll up on the sheet to remind us of it, where he said it's only in Breslov that the tzaddik, the leader, the Rebbe, is also a redeemer, right? That's nowhere else. So related to that, also only in Breslov, when the Rebbe died, he actually wasn't succeeded. In all of the other Hasidic dynasties, the Rebbe dies, and then there's a successor. It could be the son, it could be the son-in-law, it could be the nephew, but they find someone to fill the shoes of the Rebbe. Of course, the recent example of Chabad Lubavitch, when the last Rebbe died, and there was no one else to fill the role, is also an interesting analog to Rebbe Nachman, because there was this quasi-messianic, well, in some cases very not quasi, in some cases just directly messianic claim being made about the Rebbe, right? So it was similar with Rebbe Nachman, because he was seen as a kind of potential Messiah by some, maybe as actually the Messiah. So how can you replace him? You can't just find someone else and fill his shoes. He's irreplaceable. So Reb Nosson, his number one student and follower, who in a regular dynasty would have been the obvious candidate to be a successor, instead takes on this new role that had never been seen before, which was, I'm going to take my Rebbe's Torah and I'm going to be the one who brings it forward in the world, but all in his name. I'm not going to be the Rebbe, the tzaddik. I'm just going to be the one who carries on his teaching and his tradition in his name. And I mentioned before that the Breslov Hasidim had many opponents and many persecutors, partly because of these claims that were so unique. And so one of the ways that people attacked the Breslovers was they called them the Dead Hasidim. It was a nickname that people gave them to abuse them, because they said, you guys are the dead Hasidim because your Rebbe is dead. But the Breslovers had a great comeback line to this. They said, we would rather be called the Dead Hasidim because you think our Rebbe is dead, but really he's alive, meaning like he might be physically dead, but we know really like, his soul is forever and we still feel a connection to him. We would rather have a Rebbe who's dead but really alive than be like you guys who have Rebbes who are alive but really dead. Meaning like, yeah. You have your nice, you have your nice leaders. It's nice that you have somebody to work miracles for you, and that's all very nice. But your leaders are nothing compared to our Rebbe, even though he's dead. We're still in a different league to you. It's like a rivalry between sports teams or something. So let's look at the teachings. Number one, from Likutei Moran, that's why I started to explain what that was. Volume 2, which means he didn't write it, but he said it and then it was written down. If you believe that you can damage, then believe that you can fix. Very, very important teaching. Imatama amin, if you believe, sheyochlin lekalkel, it's possible to damage. Ta'amin sheyochlin letaken, believe that it's possible to fix. It's a very powerful general principle of his work. We talked before, we already mentioned a few times, he lived in these big ups and downs. He lived through tremendous internal strife. And when we suffer, when we go through turmoil, including internal turmoil, but all kinds of turmoil, it's very easy to lose hope. It's very easy to beat ourselves up, to judge ourselves harshly, to criticize ourselves to the point where we no longer think we're still in the game, where we think, what, we've just done so much harm, this isn't going to work, I'm no good, I'm not worthy, etc., etc. And this principle is like the lifeboat, or maybe actually, what's the name of the ring, the inflatable ring you throw in to get someone, right, when they're drowning in water, whatever that thing is called, the inflatable life ring, right? This to me is that. It's this incredible thing that even if you think you're drowning, Rebbe Nachman says you can always fix the damage. And I want to clarify, because some of you might be thinking that's not true, right? Some of you might be thinking that that's just not true. Of course, if I pick up a glass right now and smash it on the floor, I cannot fix that particular glass. I mean, or maybe I could, it would take a long time, right? And I probably not going to go so well. But in life, in the big picture, especially bearing in mind that in Kabbalah, one of the key tenets of Kabbalah is reincarnation. So even if I can't fix it in this lifetime, even if in this physical body, I will never be able to fix the damage I did in that relationship or whatever it was, overall, in the big picture, eventually, in the universe, that includes multiple tries to keep going around and keep trying, I can. That's the claim. That's the claim he makes. And I just want to come back together and just hear if anyone has any comments on that, any responses to that. Oh, life preserver. Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate that. Or lifesaver, either way. Let's see what else people put in these. There's so many things in the chat. This is great. Franda says he was probably an empath. Yeah, I think that's definitely right. Is there a relationship between his notion of speaking to God and Anne Legend, or precursor of the modern psychotherapy movement? Yes, we'll talk about that in this class if we get to it, actually. We have a section on that, hopefully. If not this class, we'll get to it the next one. Thank you for that, Ronnie. And we'll talk about his spiritual rebellion too, for sure, where that will be covered. Yes, Diane wants the sheet. Yes, brilliant, Julie shared it, thank you. It is believed among some that the Rebbe struggled with his sexuality. Yes, Roberta, it is. Arthur Green writes about that. Absolutely, thank you for that. And then thank you to all the people who helped me when I didn't know the word for that. Karen, we're going to go through all of these sources one by one, so we'll get there. Yeah, I'm going to type in the chat now the name. Somebody asked for the name, and it's Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. So there you go. I think now we're up to date with the comments on the chat. Yes, good. Let's keep going through the sources and keep jumping in. This is wonderful to hear your thoughts and comments. Okay, number 2. Know that a person needs to pass over a very, very narrow bridge. And the most important thing is not to fear at all. So some of you may actually know this has been turned into a song, which is sung at Jewish summer camps and other Jewish community events. Kol olam kolo, geshet sama'od, v'ha'ika lo lefached klal. That's the version that's sung in the song. Actually, the Hebrew here, I've cheated a bit in the translation. I translated it according to the song and the version people know. But the Hebrew here is actually even more interesting. I'm going to highlight it on my screen. And if you don't know Hebrew, don't worry, because I'll explain what's going on here. The last three words of the Hebrew are actually shelo yitpached klal, shelo yitpached klal. Not what he said before is the words of the song lo lefached klal, which actually is a reflexive verb. The yit, the first two letters of this word here, yit, make it a reflexive, which means what he actually said was the most important thing is not to make oneself afraid, which actually is a really beautiful psychological deepening of the lesson. It's not just don't be scared, because let's face it, everybody gets scared. Like fear will arise in everybody, but don't make yourself more scared. Don't add to your fear by adding to those conditions. So I love the kind of depth of that. I talked before about how he was speaking to what's going on inside us to a level of accuracy that wasn't it. Let's look at number 3, and then maybe we'll come back together and just see if people have comments or insights. When a person cries out to the Blessed Eternal One, they are told to move on. As it is written, why are you crying out to me? Speak to the Israelites and let them move on. So what's going on here is that in this quote from Exodus 14, the Israelites are stuck at the Reed Sea or the Red Sea, really the Reed Sea as the Torah calls it, the Yam Suf. And the sea is in front of them, and they don't know that the sea is going to split. They have no idea. And behind them is Pharaoh and his chariots chasing them. So the Israelites start crying, and God says, why are you crying out to me? Tell the people to just go, right? And it's a very strange thing for God to say at that point, because just go, just keep moving means basically telling the people to walk into a sea. Just walk into a body of water that seems like it would drown them. So Rabbi Nachman puts prayer together with action, and this little quote for me just like demonstrates this really well, because prayer is absolutely central to him. He says that prayer is absolutely essential to our own journeys, our own progress, our own everything. We can't do anything without prayer. But at the same time, there's a certain emphasis on like getting up and doing it all for yourself. Like he's not a believer in just praying. Let's put it that way. There's also a big emphasis on like taking the initiative and doing the right thing. So for me, that's what this quote does. It just puts together his approach of you have to cry out, you have to pray, but when you do pray, what you get is your marching orders. You get told what to do, and that's a very common emphasis that comes through in his teachings, this combination of prayer and action in that way. And let's come back together again to see if anyone has anything to add. Let's see. Oh, there's a few things. Did he actually talk about reincarnation? Is Rebbe Nachman? Yes, he does. Yes, he does. But he didn't invent the concept. As I say, he's as a Hasidic Rebbe, he's building on the legacy of Kabbalah that came before him, of Jewish mysticism, that started talking about Hasidism. That started talking about reincarnation in the Middle Ages. The Zohar emerged in the 13th century, and the Zohar is clearly talking about reincarnation. But I think even before that, it's alluded to in Kabbalistic texts. I think even as early maybe as the 1100s. So he's just, to him, it's natural. He got that with his mother's milk, and that's just part of the Torah and part of the tradition he was raised with. So he wouldn't have even, it wouldn't have even been a question for him. The Israelites needed faith, beautifully said, Dad. Like Heschel, praying yes, but action is necessary. Exactly. And some of you may be familiar with Heschel. Heschel was a Hasidic Rebbe. Heschel was really the bridge between the world of Hasidic wisdom and the new world of America. So a lot of what Heschel brought with him will be very familiar in these classes. God helps those who help themselves. Beautifully put, Laura. Erica says, it seems also about blind faith. If they keep going, things will turn out right, even though it doesn't seem that way. Much like Abraham sacrificing Isaac, he just kept on going with his action. Yes. Erica, that's very, very consistent with Rebbe Nachman's approach. If you do what God tells you to do, of course, how do you know what God tells you to do? But like, if you can find a way to find out what God wants you to do and you do it, then things will work out in the end for the best. Again, in a universe where there's reincarnation and you get multiple times around, it might not go right the first time around, but eventually it will come right. Steve says, can I speak to visiting grave sites? Yes. I'm just looking, there's a longer question here about the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Rebbe Nachman and Uman and the Western Wall and putting notes in. Does each site have a unique meaning to itself? Would the prayer have more power one location or another? Great. So, Steve, actually, I think we'll talk more about this when we talk about his leadership role and how that played out even after his death, which is not in this lesson so much. But I'll just say briefly, the general approach of praying at the sites of righteous people is that in their merit, our prayers will be listened to more. And that's part one. And then part two is that they may even be able to be intermediaries for us in some way, that they will even carry our prayers better than they would have gone otherwise. So praying at the grave of someone specific that we have a specific connection to is going to be more effective. And if I'm at the grave of a particular righteous person, according to this, way of looking at things, then it matters where I am. It matters that I'm at the grave of that person, and it depends on my relationship with them. And the Western Wall, I think, is a bit of a different case. The Western Wall is not so much about any particular person; it's about the whole people, and the millions of our people over the ages who have prayed at that site, both to the wall, at the wall, but also, of course, at the temple that was there before, that the wall was a supporting wall for. So it's about connecting with that energy. I think we'll talk more about that in another section now. What does, sorry I don't know your name, iPhone 845, but what does the world is a narrow bridge mean? Thank you for asking. I'm sure that other people here can articulate this also. I would say that it means life is often a narrow path between difficult choices. That often there are things on both sides, on different directions, that we could slip with. One example, for example, that the Rebbe's talk about a lot is pride and humility. That too much pride is certainly seen as a bad thing, but also if we lose pride completely and then we have low self-esteem, that's also seen as a bad thing. So like having the right amount of like healthy humility and healthy ego and healthy pride, but not too much, is a good example of that like balance, which is a fairly sensitive path to walk skillfully. So that would be an example of like how life is a narrow bridge, like not to kind of be too full of ourselves, but not to be in too much of a place of low self-esteem. Joe says, just go and do it. God helps those who help themselves. Exactly, beautifully put. Hishtadlut was taught by him. Yes, Blair. He did teach Hishtadlut, for those not familiar with the Hebrew, is this concept of trying really hard over and over again, persistence in things. That was something he very much emphasized, along with holy chutzpah, azut de kedusha. That sometimes we just need to have the holy chutzpah to just keep trying, keep going. Hitbodadut, that's talking to God in our own words, Ruth. Yeah, taught by him. That we're gonna talk about that later in this class if we get to it, or if not, next week. And that is that's about being alone in nature and talking to God in our own words. Although you can do it anytime, any place. It doesn't have to be in nature, but that's like the classic setting for it. Jay says the hand teaches the heart. Very much so, Jay. Beautifully put. Also believe in yourself, Sharon. Exactly right. That's very much part of what you're saying there too. Deb says Egypt is described as the narrow place, but we were slaves and had no freedom. Exactly. So they were leaving that behind, Deb. Exactly. Narrow is a mixed round. Exactly. Sylvia says the choices we make when we are faced with evil. Right. So that's the narrow bridge again, right? That's sometimes it's a choice between things which, choices which none of which seem to be ideal, but we have to make the best choice. Egypt is a narrow place may also be interpreted as a constriction. Exactly. So thank you for putting all that together. Right. Now I see, I didn't get it before. People are saying life is a narrow bridge, meaning that could also Egypt, which in Hebrew is Mitzrayim, meaning the place of narrowness or constriction, could also be the narrow place. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Bonnie, for articulating that. And I see now other people on the chat were alluding to that before. So there's an idea very clearly in Kabbalah, but even before that, I think that the exodus from Egypt, the leaving behind Mitzrayim, the place of narrowness, the place of slavery, is not just something that happened once upon a time to the Israelites. It's something that actually we all experience every day, potentially. So therefore, yeah, exactly. Life is a narrow bridge. We're constantly facing that narrowness and trying to find liberation from it. Beautiful. Thanks, everyone, for helping with that. Jay says one could fall off the bridge into depression, a dark place, right? Exactly. Beautiful. Right? And that's something that Rebbe Nachman himself does seem to have struggled with some version of, although we don't know exactly what. Wow. Very grateful for all these wonderful, right, Darina quoting the Haggadah. The Darina reminds us that the Haggadah itself, the central text of the Pesach ritual that we read on Seder night, says, in every generation, b'chol dor v'dor, one should see themselves as if they are leaving Egypt. Exactly. Now, someone said to me directly, narrow bridge is like a Mussar teaching. Yeah, the Mussar movement came a bit later, was definitely trying to speak to a similar kind of dynamic and similar kind of psychological needs. And Laura says, I think of it as a tightrope. Exactly. Yeah, I very much resonate with that. Awesome. Okay, let's see a little bit more text. This is really wonderful. Good. So we get to number 4. I don't know if we'll finish it in the time we have remaining today, but let's start it. The Yezam Torah. This is in many ways held to be the classic, one of the definitive teachings of the Rebbe. So let's look at it and see why it became so celebrated and so famous. It's been turned into songs, and it's like there are people who know the whole thing off by heart, so on. So know that you must judge all people favorably. This applies even to the worst of people. You must search until you find some little bit of good in them. In that good place inside them, they are not evil. If you can just find this little bit of good and judge them favorably, you really can elevate them to the side of merit. They will be able to return in teshuvah, that's return, repentance, to their best selves or to the divine. So I want to highlight something that he just said there, which is when we do this work of working really hard to find some little bit of good in someone, which we all know sometimes if we're in a conflict with somebody, is very hard to do, right? To see some good in them. If we do that work, he says, you really can elevate them to the side of merit, and they will be able to return in teshuvah. What he's saying there is, when I do the hard work of trying to see the good in someone, it doesn't only change me psychologically. It's not just like I make myself a little bit more compassionate. I actually change them in a real objective way. I change who they are and how they are, and even how God will judge them, whatever that means, of course. But the tradition says, some of you may be familiar, some of you know, but on Rosh Hashanah, these books of judgment are open, and it's decided whether we're on the side of merit or the side of guilt, or we're in between. Most of us are in between. So according to Rebbe Nachman, when we work hard to see the good in people, we elevate them, we make it more likely they will be seen on the side of merit. Carry on. Maybe they are an evil person. Even so, is it really possible that they are totally devoid of even the slightest modicum of good? How could it be that all of their life they never once did anything good? By finding one tiny good point in them, in which they are not evil, and thereby judging them favorably, you really do raise them from being guilty to having merit, until through this they return to their best selves and to the divine in teshuvah. And again, that return or repentance. And this is the meaning of the verse, just a little more and there is no sinner. So something new in this paragraph. Again, we have to work really hard to see this good in people. But he's saying, if you have to, if you're looking at the person right now and like they did this to you and they did that to you, they hurt you, you know, all these reasons running around your head, they're like why you can't see the good in them. Okay, think about their whole life. And you know, there's an earlier Kabbalistic text which talks about looking at people and imagining when they were babies. If you have to, if you can't forgive them as they are now, imagine them when they were a baby. Imagine they were pure and helpless and vulnerable, and they never did anything wrong then. And they just, you know, just like, they were just like every baby. They were just pure energy and love and joy. So imagine them then. And if you can see that in them, if you can see that's still the same person now, then again, you change who they are by seeing the good in them. I want to say about that claim that when we see the good in people, we change them. That it might sound outlandish to some of us, but actually I want to say, I think we've all had that experience of being affected by how people see us. That if people look at us and like give us the benefit of the doubt and look at the potential in us and see the positive potential in us, we've all had the experience, I think, of being raised up by that. And I think maybe also the opposite experience, right? Of not being given a chance and then being diminished by that. So that's what he's saying on one level. And then there's this verse from Psalms. And what he's doing there is a nice little play on words. The Psalm says, just a little more and there is no sinner. And he's saying, when we do this work of trying just a little more to see the good, if we can see just a little bit more good, then the sinner disappears. The sinner isn't there anymore, because instead of the sinner, the rasha, the evil person, instead of that, they are no longer that person. They are now a good person. So we have made the evil person disappear and be replaced by a good person. Let's carry on. You must also find the good in yourself. It is known that a person must take care to always be joyful and to distance themselves very, very far from depression. So as we've been talking about already a lot, you know, he's speaking from some kind of experience of this. So I want to say just about this that, you know, he started off this teaching saying, do this for other people, work hard to see the good in other people. And then he built up to doing it for ourselves. And I think the reason for that is I think he understood for a lot of people, it's easier to forgive others and see the good in others than it is to do it for ourselves. So he's saying, like, start with the low-hanging fruit. Start where it's easy. Start where it's accessible. But then ultimately, we have to do this for ourselves. Carry on. When you start looking deep inside yourself, you may think you have no good in you at all. You may feel you are full of mistakes, and the negative voice tries to make you fall into a bitter and black despair. God forbid. Don't let yourself fall into depression. Search until you find some little good in you. How could it be that you never did anything good in your whole life? When you start examining your good deed, you may see that it had many flaws and it is not pure. Even so, how could it be that your mitzvah or good deed or sacred ritual contains no good at all? It absolutely must be that any mitzvah or good deed that anyone does must contain some good point. You must search and search until you find some small good point inside yourself to enliven yourself and make yourself joyful. So what's he saying in these two paragraphs? When you start looking at yourself, if I say to all of you now, think of something you did that was good. Some of you, depending on your mood, depending on what kind of day you're having, you might find that very easy, right? If you're in a good place, you might be, oh yeah, I could think of a nice thing I did. Good, fine. When we're having a hard time though, if you're having a difficult day or a difficult year, you might struggle with that. I've certainly been through times in my life where I've struggled with that. Because when we are in the lens of, could be depression or it could just be any other kind of turmoil or struggle, that affects how we see ourselves. We judge ourselves more harshly. So then we do exactly what he says here. The negative voice inside us tries to say, oh, it wasn't really that good. That thing I did wasn't so good. I only did it to impress someone, or I only did it to get money, or, you know, I only did it for whatever reason. And it didn't really work. It didn't, you know, it wasn't so great. In other words, obviously our state of mind, our state of being affects how we see things, right? So when we're in a difficult, challenging state, it's very hard to find the good. Of course, that's when it's exactly most important to do it, because then we rewire our neural circuits and our consciousness most powerfully when it's hardest to do, of course. But of course, when it's hardest, it's hardest. So we need the most motivation and the most help. And that's what he's trying to do here. He's trying to give us encouragement. when it's hard, not to give up. He's saying you just got to keep trying. He says over and over again, you've got to keep searching. Even if the negative voice is telling you it's no good, you have to keep going. You have to say, even if it looks like that thing I did it for the worst motivations in the world, it wasn't so good. I have to still try to find some tiny bit of good in it. Okay, maybe I did do that thing to impress that person or get that money or do whatever I did. But still, some little tiny piece of good of me wanted to be kind. Some little part of me wanted to do the right thing, right? That's what he's saying. You have to try so hard to focus on that good point. And it's so, as I say, when we need it most, that's when it's hardest. Through searching and finding even just that little goodness in yourself, you truly move from being guilty to having merit. Through this, you will be able to return into tshuva, this return or repentance to our best selves, as in just a little more, then there is no sinner. When you think about his place, he won't be there. So again, that verse from Psalms and the completion of it. So again, this claim he's making is not just we will look at ourselves differently. He says, when we look at ourselves differently, you truly move from being guilty to having merit, meaning our perception of ourselves actually changes our state in the eyes of God, in the eyes of the universe, in the eyes of other people. We actually change ourselves through perception. Perception is everything. You should search for and gather good points in ourselves and others, and through this, melodies are made. This is like a musician playing an instrument who gathers the good spirit from among the spirit of depression and despair by selecting the right notes, tones, vibrations, etc. So just to explain that last bit, he made a jump there, right? He's talking over and over again about searching hard to find the good in ourselves. And then in the last bit of the teaching, he makes this claim that that's what music is. And actually, when we do this hard work of searching for the good in ourselves and others, we're actually finding the music of life. And when we do that, literally, we will compose melodies. Melody will come to us. We will find ourselves living in the music of life, because that's what music is. It's these points. If you think about the way music is written, it's these points on lines of different heights, of different lengths, of different vibrations, of different tones, that if we work hard to find the good ones, then we'll make good music. And says, when a person does not permit themselves to fall into despair, but instead revives themselves by searching, seeking, finding, gathering, and purifying their positive points from among the dregs inside them, this makes melodies. They can then pray, sing, and give thanks to the divine. For it is known that when a person becomes depressed over their gross physicality and evil deeds, and they see how very distant they truly are from holiness, it generally makes them completely incapable of praying. They cannot even open their mouth to the divine because of the strength of the depression and black bitterness and heaviness that overcomes them when they see the overwhelming distance that separates them from the divine. But when you revive yourself through this method of searching for the good in you, meaning that even if you know you've done wrong and caused damage, and remember what we said at the first teaching, if you believe you can damage, then believe you can fix. Even if you know you've damaged and that you are very, very far from God, nevertheless, you still search and seek inside yourself until you find the good that is still inside you. Then you will revive yourself and make yourself joyful. So it works, no matter how broken you think you are and how much damage you think you've done. We are almost out of time, but I think I can just read these last few lines and then come back together. And know that the one who can create these melodies by finding the good points in every Jew, even among the sinners of Israel, is fit to be the prayer leader, the one who leads prayers. For the one who leads prayer is called an emissary of the community, Shalech Tzibur, and they must indeed be that. They must find and gather all the good points which exist in each of the worshippers. All these good points will then be joined together in them, so that when they stand before God in prayer, they come with the power of all this good. Hence, they are the emissary of the community. So if you want to pray on behalf of people, if you want to lead people in prayer or any spiritual endeavor, then you have to see the good in them. Otherwise, there's no way you can do it otherwise. Because that's what it means to really lead people, to see the best in them and gather all the goodness together. Last line, the prayer leader must have this elevated quality through which all the good points desire them, so that they are joined together in them, as mentioned above. So if you have that quality of seeing the good in people, the goodness in people desires you. It is attracted to you. And then, as I said, that composes this beautiful music. So let's come back together to hear anybody's feedback of any of that. Let's see. I'm just scrolling up to where I see it's new. Wow, there's so much here. It's great. Oh, there's so much here. This is brilliant. Okay, I'm going to start from. Okay, when we're talking about seeing the good in people, Karen said in the chat, Hitler. And I want to say, Karen, and it's a very important principle for all spiritual practice. Whenever we do any spiritual practice, don't start with the hardest one, right? Start with the easiest one. Just like if you go to the gym and you want to train a new group of muscles or a new part of your body you've never trained before, you wouldn't pick up the heaviest weight in the gym, right? It's exactly the same. Our emotions, our consciousness, our brain all respond exactly like muscles that we need to train in the same way. Start with one that is manageable, easy, low-hanging fruit, and you'll increase your capacity and your strength and your ability. You'll gradually get stronger. You can work up to anyone you want. I don't know if you'll ever make it to Hitler, honestly. That's like really, above my pay grade. I certainly haven't got there myself yet, but don't start with the hardest one. That just rules out the possibility of growth or progress, right? It's like saying, because I can never run a marathon, or rather saying, because I can't run a marathon today, that I shouldn't even try and exercise. It's just like ruling it out. Darina, okay, just saying hi, fine. Sharon says we're all responsible for each other. Beautiful, exactly, right. The way that we see each other changes how we are, exactly. Julie, do we have time to keep going through the chat here? Is that going to work? Time?
Up to you, Rabbi.
Okay, I'm happy to, I want to hear what people have to say, so I'm happy to do this. David, it's the finding your good in yourself is the key teaching to a Malamed I know who is prone to depression. Thank you for sharing that. Jay, all have the spark of the divine, even if it does not shine. Beautiful, Jay, exactly. That's very much the theology here. The spark of the divine is there. Sometimes, like you say, it's not shining, so we need to help each other to do that. Deb said, I thought God was a judge and people are supposed not to judge others. Yes, Deb, we're not supposed to judge others, but of course, part of being a human being is that we all do all the time. So he's saying, since we have this tendency to judge, we have to work hard to judge on the side of merit, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to judge favorably. But not to think that we are God, exactly. Ms. Mia says, I think the process of finding good in others allows us to find the good in ourselves. I very much agree and resonate with that. And also say it's reciprocal, but I think both ways help each other. And that's why this practice is often practice of the practice to do both, like take turns, one than the other. Ruth, the lesson may be more about elevating ourselves. Also, certainly, that certainly seems to be his emphasis. Melissa, we rise or fall to others' expectations. Right, exactly. Beautifully put. Bonnie, there is a saying that we see others as we are, in other words, a mirror. Bonnie, yes, and actually the Baal Shem Tov, Rebbe Nachman's great-grandfather, and the founder of Hasidism, said this teaching very similar to that. Somebody said in direct message, was he thinking of non-Jews when looking for the good, such as Hitler at all? So within his Hasidic world, basically almost everything he says is directed and only for a Jewish audience, because he had almost no experience of and a relationship with people who weren't Jewish in any constructive way. And a lot of the interactions that him and his community had with people who weren't Jewish were antagonistic and persecutory. So that's the truth about the relationship there and the worldview. And it goes back actually to earlier Kabbalah as well, where the same thing is true. Arthur Green writes about this. Christianity said that Jews were metaphysically evil and were the Antichrist. So then Jews kind of internalized that and projected back a similar claim about Christians, and that became a key part of Kabbalah. Deb says we should only care about what is important to us and not try to please others. That's certainly a very helpful principle, and he talks about this holy chutzpah in the light of that. Judy says, perhaps as a tzaddik, a righteous person, he himself didn't absolve or take away sin, but in the quote of seeing the good and potential of good in another, seeing them favorably, that elevates the person to make teshuva and is no longer a sinner. So, Julie, we'll talk more about that whole issue of like taking away sin and being a tzaddik next time. But both kinds of response to that. I'm going to finish going through the chat, and then I see some people have raised their hands. So we'll get to you too. Marty says, "Are sinners necessarily evil in Judaism, or those who have somehow missed the mark?" Really, a very important distinction there, because really our word for sinning, chet, just means we missed the mark. But also, Marty, in the text we just read, he deliberately uses the word sinner, and sorry, not sinner, but he deliberately uses the word rasha, which actually means a wicked person. So he's saying, even if someone is not only a sinner, but actually a wicked person, we can still do this and it's still true for that. Very strong claim. Ms. B. Mia says, in early debates during the 2016 election, an audience member commented on the hateful rhetoric and asked each candidate to say one good thing about the other. I remember that. That was very beautiful. One person did not comply. The other said, he seems to love his children. Yeah, that was a good moment. Thank you for that. Frank says, if we know, as Rebbe Nachman knew, and the Kabbalists taught, that there is nothing that is not God, yes, that's the principle of Kabbalah, however named, it is easier to see that there is a segment of the one who is in all people, even those that do evil act. Beautifully put, Frank. That's exactly what's going on here, that spark of God in everyone. Oh my God, there's another 30 things. Hey, I need more water. Hold on. Friends, this is brilliant. This is wonderful. Ronnie says, I've always found Rebbe Nachman delightful and inspiring. Learning that he suffered from depression makes his words all the more uplifting and touching. Exactly, Ronnie. Yeah, I feel the same. Frank says there is a difference between thinking a person is evil or seeing the evil acts that person, a person who is in the image and likeness of God does. Absolutely, Frank. Totally agree with that. Deb says, is there really a connection between being too critical of ourselves and depression always? Deb, I wouldn't say that's always a connection, but I think, there can often be a correlation there. I think that's the claim being made. Isn't this concept of being joyful an essential part of his teachings? Yes, Joe, and we will talk more about that. Have to do it next time now because we're running out of time today. Rochelle, people are like superheroes. They can use their power for good or evil. I love that. That's exactly right. Sharon, it is sad that he himself suffered from depression, but still wanted to help people. Right, and it's also related, right? The way that he related to people is related to his own suffering. Therapist, what's the worst that can happen? Client, oh, okay. Thank you for that, Brana. Darina, it's the other way around. The depression tells you that you're good for nothing. It twists your perception of reality in that direction. Right, beautifully put, Darina. Yeah, I think there's a lot of back and forth between these different parts of us. Deb said, didn't he start the nigun? He didn't invent the concept of a wordless melody or nigun, but he did invent many of them. And yes, music, and it was very important to him. And actually, that's a big theme. The class is actually named for that because it's a big theme of what I want to study, and we will study together. A lot of sources related to that. And that's a big technique he talks about changing our state of mind with and raising ourselves up from depression with. To adapt a comment of Albert Einstein, when we imagine ourselves separate from the one who is, we are suffering from an optical delusion of consciousness. Yeah, Rabbi Nachman actually said something very similar to that also, Frank. So you're right on the money. That you're so welcome. All the people are saying thank you. You're very welcome. Erica says it's interesting that he focuses so much on introspection, self-evaluation, self-assessment, as well as some negative aspects of low self-esteem, yet also offers ways to overcome those feelings. It's actually quite self-motivating and encouraging and allows us to find even one good thing in ourselves and others, which is the lifeline to redeeming ourselves to ourselves. It's a lot more self-empowering than what we read from many other spiritual leaders. Yeah, Erica, beautifully put. And I think that's why this teaching in particular, but in general, his teachings have become so popular in recent decades, and often with people who resonate on the level that you were just describing there. You're welcome again, all the people saying thank you. This is a pleasure. When and if one discovers some good, perhaps that will lead to more conscious good life. Exactly, right. Anna, beautifully put. When I see, because if I'm walking around thinking I'm a bad person, then it's like okay for me to be bad. I'm going to act bad because I think I'm bad. But if I see that I actually have good in me, that will encourage me to do more good things. Friends, I'm afraid I can't keep going. I have to draw the line somewhere, but I see there's so many more wonderful good things. I wish I could see all of them. So I want to ask a favor. If your message was not just saying thank you, if it was a question or a comment that you want to share with the class, please save it for next time. And the beginning of next week's class, we'll start by people sharing your questions. And also that applies to the people who I see. I'm sorry that Deeru, you had your hand raised patiently, but please write your question down, and we'll start next class with time for questions and comments, and then we'll continue together.